My point of entry into that debate is actually quite specific because most of my research around audiences is either about children or about girls or women. And so there's been a lot of research done on children audiences, as you well know, and also on girl audiences and girl consumers. And there's been, loads and loads of research that says that, girls don't know how to interpret media in a sophisticated way, that they use it it's very trivial to them, that children somehow are either too innocent or just not knowledgeable enough to understand the messages they're receiving. And so if they can't understand it, then they may make bad decisions about what to do with those messages. I think that it actually doesn't make a lot of sense in my own research to think of this in terms of some sort of binary between really media savvy and really, kind of media ignorant, because I think that we can be both at the same time. I think that I'm pretty media savvy, and I can talk to my students and they will understand something completely different, and most of the time much more accurate, I think, than what I understand. So there are ways in which we become literate in different mediums, and so to think of us as all media savvy or as all media ignorant, I think kind of misses how complex the interaction between messages, media, and audiences are.
So audiences as groups are gullible and media savvy because they live in a particular context where the context has alerted them to something that might be false or problematic, but it has also, in a way, inured them to false and problematic things, which are discourses in their everyday life, which they don't then question. So, for instance, adult audiences seem to believe that they're always going to be more critical than child audiences. Let's just take this view, and you sit child audiences and adult audiences down in what's known as a family film or a romantic comedy, and you'll find the child audiences making far more sharp, perceptive comments, and actually quite poignant comments about the representation of children, where adults simply swallow those representations as if they're unproblematic. And the adults, of course, are very alert to things like brand management and the insertion of brands into films, and the children are not really that interested because they don't have the money for it. But the adults are worried that the children are getting influenced by that. So audiences are both extremely savvy about some things, but also extremely vulnerable to influence in areas where their own lives ideologically lead them to a set of beliefs. And I would include myself in that, for instance, I'll give you an example. Watching one of Michael Moore's documentaries years ago, I was swept along with the emotions, with the visual juxtapositions, and with the group of people I was watching with, all anti-capitalists. And yet, when you look at what evidence he presents, it's a narrative. It's a narrative, it's emotional. There are jump cuts which are visually stunning but logically problematic. Maybe you emotionally identify with the argument, but it actually prevents you from having a sense of what's difficult or troubling about that. And so over the years, I think I've learned to see audiences as all of them, all of us, both incredibly vulnerable and more so at particular points in history, but also more and more technologically savvy.
I am in the middle. Yes, absolutely, people know how to manipulate media. Absolutely, they know how to engage with it. And of course, they're not just mindlessly duped by everything they see. At the same time, I think it would be incorrect to say that repeated exposure to repeated media representations have no effect on people whatsoever. It almost goes against the face, again, how we know how cognition works, and how people are consistently affected by environmental stimuli at the subliminal level, whether they want to be or not, and whether they know it or not. So I'm somewhere in the middle to suggest that, yeah, people can absolutely have agency. Absolutely, they can manipulate media, do with it, more or less whatever they want with it. But at the same time, they're also affected by it to the extent that they're not necessarily aware of it.
I think I would position myself in this as a slightly skeptical but also cautious user of the term audiences, because I think the S in the audiences is really important here. And making claims like audiences or the audience is media savvy, like all young people know what to do with technologies and engage with media all the time and they're perfectly comfortable in that environment, for example, is an overgeneralization that doesn't help anybody. And I think that's where my cautionary tale comes in. I don't think audiences are media savvy or completely clueless and victims and kind of subject to the media influences or effects that we hear other people talk about. And I think that's why it's important to think of audiences as embedded in all kinds of social structures, especially in everyday life, in their environments, their families, the schools, work, the environments that they move in, and how those might influence what they know and what they are able to do with and how they are able to interpret content, how they are able to create content, because I think that's a very important aspect of audiences as well. So I think we need to think about it not as the audience or an effect on audiences or audiences as savvy, but as a diversity of audiences, and that we really need to understand the context of where they come from to be able to draw conclusions about their literacy or their engagement with media.
This is the question that has been occupying so many scholars in media and communications over decades, and it's a debate that will not go away. In many ways, I think in order to find the answer, we have to start by thinking of how we understand humans. How do we understand humanity and our potentials and also our limitations? So do we believe that humans make decisions and reflect on what they decide to do or not? If we accept that we all have the ability to make decisions, at least informed to a certain extent, then we might accept that media audiences are active audiences, are media savvy, because we always choose. We always choose to a certain extent what we watch, what we post, who we engage with. At the same time, our understanding of our choices and our potential to make choices does not usually imply that we're all free-floating individuals. As individuals, we might be constrained by what our teachers say or what our parents say, how much money we have to spend on buying a technology, for example, how much time we have to use to balance between writing an essay and watching our favorite series and so on. So we're never free-floating. We're never fully free to make decisions as media audiences. So I think to the question, to come back to the original question, are audiences media savvy or easily influenced? The answer is always contextual, and the answer in many ways is always somewhere between. We do always have constraints, we have conditions we're subject to, but also we always have agency and reflexive understanding of the world.
I'm very conscious that in the field of media and communications generally, there's a lot of claims made about audiences. There's a lot of way in which audiences are spoken for rather than directly listened to. And those views are very often pejorative, very often that audiences are variously mindless or idiotic or easily manipulated. And every time as a researcher I, as it were, go out of the university and talk to people directly, I am made to listen to their perspective and to see what's meaningful for them in the context in which they live and engage with media. And that doesn't mean that I'm persuaded that they are incredibly savvy and know everything and have the answer to everything, but there is a rationale to be understood, there is a context to be understood, there's motivations, and once we've started attending to all of that, I think that really puts the lie to the claims that they are all mindless and indeed that they're all the same.
Well, there are a lot of cliches around. I don't like the word media savvy myself because it implies that some people are naturally knowledgeable about certain aspects of the media, which they should be, and others presumably are not. And I think things are much more complicated than that. Yes, young people tend to have certain facility with certain aspects of media. That doesn't mean to say that they naturally, at that stage of their life, have an ability to reflect on the role of media institutions in society that they've not yet fully joined and that remains largely mysterious to them. And that's something I've felt from the beginning of doing research, from talking to friends, family, is that people who know nothing about the details of media, actually, if you can ask the right question, have very strong feelings about the way things should be with media, and can get very angry and worried when things don't seem that way, when they find something unethical. So I think people have hidden layers of sophistication and ethical reflection that it's not easy to get to, because a lot of it's covered over with industry language, and most of the time people don't care what they think. They're not asked. I think people have a lot of subtle reflexivity which is not touched by terms like media savvy or whatever, though they might have some relevance. It's a really interesting question, what skills people actually have to reflect on media in society and the way it should be.